This is the Asia Trade. I'm Haidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney, where the market has just opened. The top stories this hour. Markets are bracing for Trump's tariffs. The president saying Canada and Mexico will be hit on Saturday, with China still in his sights. That sends the dollar and US crude higher, while treasuries pair gains. Apple shares jump as quarterly revenue sets a record, but China sales are even weaker than feared. Intel beating the street, but warning of challenges ahead amid a leadership shake-up. Plus, the search for answers after the worst US air disaster in decades, a mid-air collision over Washington claiming 67 lives. It was a fairly placid day turned volatile on US markets. That tariff threat from President Trump on Canada and Mexico and a slew of tech earnings playing out in the after-hours session, all at play there. We saw US stocks initially buckling on the news, eventually recovering, but we're watching for sort of the washout when it comes to those Intel and Apple results, not to mention Samsung coming online a little bit later on as South Korea reopens and those final numbers come to us as well. At the moment, we are seeing a pretty slow start, a little bit of upside when it comes to trading here in Sydney. Nikkei futures looking like we'll see a bit of a pop at the start of the session there as well. Dollar yen steady after what has been really kind of a steady stream of commentary that has been broadly positive for the yen, paving the way for further policy normalization there. Looking at dollar China largely unchanged. But take a look at US futures as we continue to watch the after-hour session, of course. And it really has been that dual tech story with Apple suppliers in focus today as well. That China weakness, the iPhone weakness will be in focus today, as well as the impact across Asia. Taking a look at Apple, we are seeing some gains there, as for Intel as well, as those fourth quarter numbers beat estimates during this ongoing turnaround. But take a look at the market reaction when it comes to the big geopolitical story, of course. President Trump reiterating that on February the 1st, they would see this 25% tariff rate being hit on Canada and Mexico. We saw that big impact when it comes to the Mexican peso as well as the Canadian loonie. He also, of course, reiterated that China is still in their sights for the tariffs situation as well. Take a listen.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons. Number one is the people that have poured into our country so horribly and so much. Number two are the drugs, fentanyl, and everything else that have come into the country. And number three are the massive subsidies that we're giving to Canada and to Mexico in the form of deficits. And I'll be putting the tariff of 25% on Canada and separately 25% on Mexico. And we will really have to do that because we have very big deficits with those countries. Those tariffs may or may not rise with time.
Let's bring Bloomberg's political news director, Jody Schneider, with more. And Jody, we know that he said that 25% could just kind of be the starting rate. Do we know yet what's going to be included? Crude, for example. What do we know?
Yeah, so Heidi, he has threatened this. Donald Trump threatened. First he said around February 1st, then the date became clearer, and of course that's this weekend. And today he said in a signing ceremony with some executive orders related to that plane crash here at Washington National Airport, he basically said that Canada and Mexico should get ready for that 25% tariff, that he's about to do this. Now, of course, he did threaten a tariff against Colombia last weekend, and it was a very short trade war. He wanted Colombia to take military plane loads of their migrants back. And when they said they wouldn't do it, he threatened the tariffs. And when they said, OK, they would, the tariffs were off. So this may be a negotiating tactic with Canada and Mexico, but we'll have to see. One thing he said may be exempt would be crude oil, depending on the price.
And of course, he sort of said, we're not forgetting about China, right? Do we know if the administration is sort of any further on its determination with that?
Yeah, interestingly, we all presumed that China would be, the first to get these tariffs in his presidency. It's something he campaigned on heavily, and in his first term did impose those tariffs on China, some of which remain today. He keeps threatening on China, but has not had a specific proposal beyond the 10% he said he might do. So he keeps kind of warning China, but has been much more specific with our neighbors to the north and south in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. With China, perhaps he'll see how it goes with Canada and Mexico and then look to China. Many economists have, of course, warned that if he has stiff tariffs against China, it would have a very inflationary effect, something that one would presume the Trump administration wants to avoid.
Jody, of course, the whole country is still reeling over the American Airlines aviation disaster. It's become pretty quickly politicized by the president.
Yes, it has. The president today had a remarks briefing where he started out expressing sadness and saying, you know, the victims and their families were in his thoughts, but then very quickly turned to saying that DEI, diversity and inclusion policies in the previous administration might have been a factor in the plane crash, saying that perhaps the best people were not hired by the FAA, and that could have led to the crash. And this, of course, got a lot of attention here in Washington today as they're pulling bodies out of the Potomac River, and the president also sort of speculating on the causes, the purported causes of the crash, something that's not usually done, that's left to FAA and National Transportation Safety Board officials who look at the facts of this and then come up with their diagnosis of what happened.
We didn't just hear that from Trump, right? We heard that from J.D. Vance. We heard that from Pete Hegseth as well. And I do wonder how closely are we watching this administration, you know, just days in, and how they handle this incident at the same time as we're still seeing, you know, confirmation hearings and the pieces of the cabinet being put in place.
Yeah, it was a busy day, busy news day on a lot of fronts. We did have, first of all, as you note, Pete Hegseth and Sean Duffy being the new transportation secretary, only on his second day at the job was at the microphones with the president today. But we also had on Capitol Hill today Tulsi Gabbard's hearing for Director of National Intelligence. A lot of tough questions from Democrats mostly, but she appears to be the most endangered of the nominees. We also heard from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For his nomination to be the head of Health and Human Services. He was before the Health Committee today. Some tough questions as well there. And Kash Patel to lead the FBI. The betting in Washington was that probably Kash Patel and RFK Jr. will get through, but that Tulsi Gabbard may have the most trouble, given a range of views that she was really pressed on the Hill today.
Bloomberg's political news director Jody Schneider there with a lot of headlines that we're following, and some of the other stories that we're tracking this hour as well. The European Union has resuspended its case against China at the World Trade Organization over allegations of economic coercion targeting Lithuania. The case was first filed in 2022 after Beijing imposed trade restrictions on Lithuania due to its official contact with Taiwan. The EU had suspended the case in 2024 but resumed it last week to prevent the case from lapsing. President Trump has insisted that Egypt and Jordan will take in Palestinians from Gaza, despite both countries rejecting that idea. Meanwhile, Israel has released another 110 Palestinian prisoners under the ceasefire deal after a brief delay over the safety of Israeli hostages. The next hostage prisoner swap is expected to go ahead on Saturday, as planned. FTX co-founder Sam Bankman-Fried's parents are said to be exploring ways to secure a pardon for him from President Trump. Bloomberg has learned that Joseph Bankman and Barbara Fried have had meetings with people in Trump's orbit about clemency for their son, but it's unclear if they've reached out to the White House. The one-time crypto billionaire was sentenced to 25 years in prison for fraud. Coming up on the Asia Trade, we'll be talking through Apple's mixed earnings report, that weakness out of China, and the iPhone sales number as well. TECHnalysis will be joining us. Infrastructure capital investors as well coming along with us to give us their market outlook. And Daiwa Securities joining us to unpack Samsung's fourth quarter earnings, those final numbers expected this hour. Much more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
If you look at our Greater China revenue for the quarter, we were down 11% year over year. And over half of the decline that we experienced was driven by change in channel inventory.
That was Apple CEO Tim Cook there commenting on the firm's revenue decline in China, which was really one of the sort of rough spots in, an otherwise pretty impressive set of earnings from Apple, and the forecast was also sort of quite positive there as well. But certainly that miss when it comes to Greater China revenue, of course, historically one of their strongest and most important markets, as well as that decline in iPhone sales as well. A couple of the spots that marred what was otherwise a pretty good quarter. But let's bring in Bloomberg technology reporter Mark Gurman for all things Apple. So, we know that the China market has been difficult for some quarters now, but was this a surprise to you?
It was a surprise that it came in not only much lower than last year, but much lower than Wall Street expectations. They were down 11%, and 11% when you're talking about $20 billion, that is quite significant. Tim Cook tried to explain it away. He said that this was an inventory-related issue, or at least half of the shortfall was an inventory-related issue. And what he means by that is they projected worse sales in China than actually was the case. They simply didn't have enough product to sell through and make that revenue. And so I think what you're seeing on the stock growth this afternoon, or in the morning where you are, the growth there is in response to Q2 being stronger than anticipated, that guidance, but also because the belief that those China sales that were missed in Q1, to Cook's point, are going to be recuperated in the second quarter, right? When a customer is not able to buy an Apple product because it's not in stock, it's not like they're going to give up on that purchase. They're going to come back. And so I think that's what we're seeing here. Guidance was pretty good. Foreign exchange headwinds aside, they're banking on 4% annual growth, which is pretty good for a Q2 in Apple's perspective compared to a few of the years prior. Obviously, 23 and 24 were a little bit on the weaker side. So in terms of the guidance, it's pretty good. But we cannot ignore that the iPhone decline on an annual basis came in well below Wall Street expectations. And that China number, 11%, that is quite significant of a drop.
And that iPhone decline, some of it was being explained away by its lack of enthusiasm over Apple Intelligence, right? Does that tell us that they need to do more to accelerate that?
I mean, Apple Intelligence today is a marketing gimmick. You're going to see more features in the coming months, particularly with Shery, particularly new languages and new locations. And so they really need to upgrade it. They are so behind OpenAI, so behind Gemini, so behind DeepSeek now and the China-based players that it's sort of embarrassing. Maybe it is fully embarrassing. But I think more than that, it's surprising that the leader in technology, consumer technology for so many years, is behind in such a crucial area of artificial intelligence.
What were some of the bright spots in terms of, services was pretty good, maybe some of the other product categories? Are we expecting kind of a game changer with the next iPhone refresh at all?
Well, if you look at the top line, the overall revenue growth, an all-time revenue record, and 4% growth on an annual basis at these large numbers of about $124.3 billion, extraordinarily impressive. So that shouldn't be missed. iPad growing 14%, Mac growing, iPad 15% and Mac 16%. Those shouldn't be ignored either. Those two product categories have been beleaguered in recent years. But now, with these newer models, the M4 chip in the latest Macs, the penetration the iPad Air and the lower-end iPad Mini are having in the market, I think they've done a good job on those two categories.
So when it comes to AI, as you say, maybe it's mostly a marketing gimmick, it's really lagging a lot of its peers, but it's also not even available in these key markets, right? Are they going to be able to partner with someone in China to be able to offer those services eventually?
Okay, so let's just take a step back here. It's not really that great. So people in the countries that Apple Intelligence doesn't work in, you're not really missing much, right? You're not really missing anything, right? So it's about getting it working properly and then bringing it to those markets. It could be global and not work well. That's not going to do anything for sales, right? Apple's trying to say that countries that had Apple Intelligence did better than countries for the iPhone 16 that don't have Apple Intelligence. I think it's because of how strong they've been marketing these features, right? The reality is this technology needs to get up to snuff. They are so behind OpenAI, Google Gemini, I would say they're 2.5 years behind. They think they're about 2 to 3 years behind. So that's what the focus needs to be on. I wouldn't keep pushing this out to countries unless I'm going to do so with better functionality. And so they're going to try to walk and chew gum here.
Bloomberg Technology reporter Mark Gurman there with the latest on Apple. We're also watching Intel shares higher in late trade after it put up better than expected fourth quarter revenue, but also warning that its return to competitiveness will take some time. Bloomberg Intelligence senior technology analyst Mandeep Singh joins us now for more. Mandeep, positive, but it's clear that leadership is trying to manage expectations and be very realistic here.
Yeah, and also they called out, there was a pull forward because of tariffs. So the 1Q guide is softer, clearly. The 4Q results were better than expected. But look, in the case of Intel, it's going to be a cost-cutting story for a while. I expect whoever gets, assigned as the new CEO, the ask would be, how can we get Intel back to positive free cash flow, really figure out what businesses to keep, what businesses to divest. And I would say that will be the Intel story, at least for the next couple of years.
There's also the focus on just the basic fact that they need to improve their chip technology, right? Particularly when it comes to accelerators. Is that always going to be a drag when it comes to not being able to keep up with Nvidia?
Yeah, look, they are losing, almost $10–15 billion a year on the foundry, and a lot of that foundry business is used for internal Intel chips, but clearly they have to figure out a way to either get more external business from the hyperscalers, and maybe, the administration change could be a positive in the sense that there is an impetus around bringing chip manufacturing back to the U.S. and really, creating more incentive than the CHIPS Act money that they were getting. So a lot could happen over the course of the next 6 months in terms of their foundry business, whether Intel keeps that or somehow the unit economics improve. And, it helps the free cash flow side of the equation. But clearly, right now, it's a drag. And maybe they may be better off, outsourcing some of their manufacturing to TSMC, especially on the leading node side, because that's where clearly they're not able to execute very well.
And it's interesting, we didn't get an update on the search for a permanent CEO. And as you say, there's lots of options, including possibly a breakup. Do you think they need to keep sort of all these possibilities on the table?
Yeah, look, when you look at Intel's, woes, a lot of them stem from the fact that the client PC business is still generating a very good free cash flow. On the server side, they are losing a lot of money, market share. And on the foundry side as well, the unit economics are just terrible. So clearly, when the new CEO gets picked, the first thing they have to assess is what businesses to keep. And Mobileye is also a non-controlling business they have, and Altera, which is a small pocket of networking revenue. So all these, when you look at the sum of the parts for Intel, you have to really kind of figure out what is it that works for Intel long term in terms of turning around the company. And I'm sure, I think divesting some of the assets would be the first step that the new CEO would take.
Bloomberg Intelligence Technology senior analyst Mandeep Singh there. And of course, we're sticking on the big topic of tech today with those final Samsung numbers expected to come through a little bit later on as well. And this, of course, coincides with the reopen of trading in Korea, closed for the past few days and really kind of potentially getting some of that suppressed reaction to the seismic moves that we've seen across global markets on account of DeepSeek. So we're watching the likes of Samsung as well as SK Hynix after what has been a really wild week. When it comes to Samsung and also the impact of DeepSeek as well, we'll be watching very closely for commentary from Samsung executives, really gauging Samsung's positioning in that AI race, right? After we saw DeepSeek forcing markets to question a lot of these big valuations underpinning the likes of SK Hynix, their key rival, of course, Nvidia as well was obviously the other major one. So we'll be seeing that reaction for Samsung as well. The preliminary operating profit and revenue numbers already came out earlier this month, so they're expected to give that update when it comes to efforts to try and keep up with high bandwidth memory and that lucrative market there as well. When it comes to the net estimate for the fourth quarter, just over 7 trillion won there. Operating profit coming in at just shy of 7.5 trillion won is the estimate. So we'll continue to watch that very closely over the next hour or so. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Well, India's government is set to present its budget on Saturday, the first of Prime Minister Modi's third term. The spending plan is expected to focus on efforts to boost consumption as the government tries to stave off an economic slowdown. Our Bloomberg Insight anchor Haslinda Amin has more.
For 3 years, the Indian economy bounced back from the COVID-19 pandemic with 8% average growth. Now, the world's most populous nation faces a deepening slowdown. Was the 3-year boom just a blip rather than the start of a new era? India's finance minister says it's the weak growth that's a blip. But investors have already turned bearish. A Bloomberg survey found a majority of strategists and fund managers expect the Nifty 50 index to drop at least 5% in the 3 months through March. Putting high growth back on track is top of the agenda for the Reserve Bank of India's new governor.
The huge responsibility that we have in ensuring that the growth that this country actually has, that continues.
But as Sanjay Malhotra's move from the Finance Ministry to the Central Bank boosted bets on a rate cut, the Indian rupee dropped to a record low against the US dollar. This economic pressure comes less than a year after Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party lost ground in Parliament, largely over bread and butter economic worries. Over 2025, Modi will face new and familiar challenges at home and abroad. The BJP will contest provincial elections in Delhi, the national capital, and the electorally important state of Bihar.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear that I
Then there's the return of Trump. The US president has been keeping a close eye on India's trade policies.
The biggest charger of all is India. India is a very big charger.
Protectionist counter-punches would hurt an economy that needs exports to grow as Modi continues to set ambitious goals even after the slowdown.
By the end of the next decade, India will surpass the $10 trillion mark.
2 years ago, Modi was enjoying India's moment in the sun. In 2025, Asia's third largest economy may need a reset. Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg News.
Take a look at what we're watching when it comes to the most direct reaction that we've seen to the tariff threat from President Trump. Of course, February 1st is the date that is given for 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. It's unclear whether oil is going to be included in that, but see that big reaction when it comes to the Mexican peso, the loonie, as well as a bit of upside in crude. We do have some breaking news in terms of data on the labour market for Japan as well as CPI numbers for Tokyo. Let's get to the jobs numbers first. For the month of December, the jobs rate actually ticking a little bit lower to 2.4% from 2.5%, which was both that prior November reading and also the estimate as well. The job to applicant ratio staying unchanged at 1.25 there, according to the data that we are just getting across the Bloomberg. When it comes to Tokyo CPI, that January year-on-year number at 3.4%, that is a little bit more hotter than expectations of 3% and a jump from the 3% in December as well. Stripping out fresh food, we're seeing a gain of 2.5% in line with expectations, and stripping out, of course, more volatile energy as well as fresh food prices, 1.9%. So in line with expectations, but still a little bit of an uptick from the previous month. And of course, all of this just in addition to what we heard from Governor Ueda a little bit earlier last week, as well as further BOJ commentary. A lot of this is just continuing to pave the way when when it comes to expectations for further monetary policy normalization from the Bank of Japan. Food prices, though, which is interesting at the moment, matter perhaps a little bit more than usual for the Bank of Japan. They typically tend to play down the significance of these moves, but we are starting to see that food shock when it comes to the last couple of CPIs having a little bit more of a weighting there. So potentially really reinforcing the view that more rate hikes and perhaps more hawkishness from the Bank of Japan is coming. We also do have some breaking news when it comes to the tech story that we've been following. Nvidia is said to approve Samsung's 8-layer HBM3E AI memory, and we are just seeing that development crossing the Bloomberg here as well. And of course, such a big week, and not all of it positive when it comes to chip makers, including Nvidia, with the big sell-off as a result of the sort of seismic expectations changing by the Chinese AI group DeepSeek. But Samsung Electronics, we are hearing at the moment, obtaining approval to supply a version of that 5th-gen high bandwidth memory chips to Nvidia, according to people familiar with the matter. Samsung's still behind SK Hynix, which is a supplier of that 12-layer chip as well. So we continue to watch that very closely. It is progressive, albeit perhaps a small step in progress, with Samsung's now year-long struggle to gain that approval from Nvidia. We'll be getting those final numbers from Samsung and hearing from the leadership a little bit later today as well. Staying with tech, and Apple has given a reassuring revenue forecast for the current quarter that boosted shares in the after-hour session after those holiday results showed some pretty jarring declines when it comes to the China market, as well as flagging iPhone declines as well. So Bob O'Donnell is the President and Chief Analyst at TECHnalysis Research and joins us now. So you can't really go past the weakness that we continue to see out of China, but perhaps the extent of that weakness surprised a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, Heidi. I mean, there's been a concern for a while now with regards to Apple in China, because we've seen, of course, much more emphasis on domestic brands, on Huawei, on some of the others there in China. And so there has been this question mark around Apple and what would happen. And of course, Apple's latest phone, the iPhone 16 with Apple Intelligence, those intelligence features are not available in China. Although, truth be told, they haven't really had the same kind of impact on U.S. sales that I think a lot of people were expecting as well. So that may or may not be a big factor. The big question will be looking ahead. As you said, the forecast was pretty strong. So we'll see how that plays out for the iPhone. But that is a concern, is Apple is generally seen as being somewhat behind on these AI capabilities. Speaking of Samsung, they just announced their new Galaxy S25 with some pretty impressive AI features in conjunction with Google. So it's making the market significantly more interesting, that's for sure.
And we're not used to Apple being, trying to play catch-up as opposed to being always a trendsetter, the market leader when it comes to cutting-edge tech, right? Or at least, packaging it in a way that is so appealing to consumers. What do they need to do when it comes to catching up with AI? Because, they've said, because AI is not available, the AI service is not available in markets like the EU and China. But, as Mark Gurman said, well, they're also not missing out on very much in those markets at this point.
Well, exactly right. I mean, Mark's right. And that's what I was hinting at. I mean, because they really haven't had a big factor. I mean, look, Apple is very good, as you said, at taking a technology that other companies may have created or done something with before them and really making it usable for the average person. The problem is right now, it just doesn't work that well. And that's really kind of been the fundamental factor. So there's work for Apple to do just to execute on getting their AI capability up to the standards that people are now expecting, and people are rapidly moving forward, and they still haven't integrated the ability to connect with OpenAI servers, which is something they're going to plan to do. And of course, we'll see how they move forward. They've talked about connecting with Google as well for Google Gemini and making that an option with the iPhone. But bottom line is Apple's got to make this stuff work in a way that we're starting to see these other companies start to deliver on.
It's been a week that's been dominated by a lot of analysis and reaction to DeepSeek, right? And I do wonder, is there an opportunity now for Apple in China with the emergence of DeepSeek, because it could potentially contribute to, upgrade of phone cycles, upgrade of, what developers can do, and just a broader upgrade of technology that would benefit Apple in China?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting perspectives, I think, on the DeepSeek news was the fact that what they seemed to be doing was being able to do some of this AI work with significantly less electrical power and some levels of compute power. So what we've already seen is other companies, because it's open source, take those DeepSeek models, bring them down and make them available to run, for example, on PCs. We saw Microsoft just announce that today. You can get DeepSeek to run on a Windows PC now. And there's discussion of bringing those capabilities to smartphones on Android and certainly Apple as well. So it's going to be interesting to watch. The challenge that Apple's going to have is kind of navigating the geopolitical issues that surround AI, but they have talked about bringing in other AI model partners since they're not doing their own models. Again, as I suggested already, they've talked about Google in addition to OpenAI. Potentially they could work with DeepSeek in China and other places, but I think that's a long way off. But the notion of being able to do more of these AI capabilities directly on the device without having to be connected to the cloud is definitely something that I think DeepSeek is making more people aware of.
Do you think that's a game changer when it comes to more efficiency in both training and running AI models?
I think in the long run it is. Look, I mean, I'm not saying, to be very clear, because the obvious implication is, well, what does that mean for Nvidia, right? I mean, Nvidia is still very strong. There's going to be a huge demand for Nvidia, for AMD, for these other types of competitive chips. But I do think the path that we were headed down of these massive energy needs and the impact on the energy grids was simply not sustainable. So inevitably, we were going to see some of these types of things happen. And, Qualcomm's been talking about doing this on smartphones for a while. We've seen other companies talk about doing this on PCs as well. And this is yet another step in that direction. So it's kind of a larger than incremental step that we saw with DeepSeek, but fundamentally we are moving in the direction of more efficient use of AI, and that's been true honestly for the last couple of years. And this was just sort of a bigger step, and then I think we'll see people build on that. That's the beauty of leveraging open source, and I think we're going to see a lot of companies take advantage of that capability.
Intel's numbers are good, but obviously still a long road ahead, and management sort of acknowledged that as well. What do you sort of expect, and what do you think you'd want to see from leadership, given that they still don't have, a confirmed new CEO? What are the options when it comes to a potential breakup or divestment?
Sorry, Heidi. Yeah, I mean, obviously, they're going to need to name a CEO and get that nailed down. But look, fundamentally, what Intel is doing is they're trying to really figure out, all right, what are the things we need to focus on? They talked today in the call about dropping a product that was originally on the roadmap to simplify things. They're really working more extensively with their partners than they have in a long time. Just today, Microsoft and Intel introduced a new version of the Microsoft Surface PCs with Intel's latest Lunar Lake chips. And so we're seeing a lot of effort on Intel's part. But look, this is a long-term thing. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's multiple years. They talked about that today in the earnings as well. Foundry profitability is more like 2027. They're going to get some incremental business from that foundry. They're going to work on being more efficient. To me, the good news is, it was actually a reasonably decent number. It was higher than what the market expected. The forecast was a little weaker, and that's why we saw the market react the way it did. But look, they're starting to execute on this. They're starting to bring back that old Andy Grove paranoia of trying to really get better and better. And fundamentally, I think they are on the right path. It's going to take a couple of years, and a lot of times the market doesn't, have that much patience. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do in 2025.
We've also just had that sort of incremental progress when it comes to Samsung getting that nod on the less advanced memory chip version there. What are your expectations when it comes to hearing from Samsung's leadership?
Yeah, I mean, look, HBM3 is an essential part of powering all this AI work. And as you mentioned, it's SK Hynix and it's been Micron delivering HBM3 up till now. And Samsung has really kind of fallen behind. So this is, like you said, it's an incremental step, but it's an important one to say, okay, finally, we're in the mix. We can start to delivering these components to Nvidia and other people building these cards and the big server systems powering these AI models. So that's going to be important. As I said, I was at the launch of the S25 just a week ago, and it's a pretty good-looking product. And again, what they did in conjunction with Google was kind of give a sense of, hey, these are the kinds of things that are going to be possible with AI. So now, is that going to mean anything for this quarter? Of course not. But does it give an interesting perspective moving forward, especially as we see some challenges with Apple around AI? I think it does. So I think that's going to be something that's going to be interesting to watch.
Bob, always great to chat with you. Bob O'Donnell, President and Chief Analyst at TECHnalysis Research. Do have some breaking news when it comes to central bank action around the world. Argentina cutting the key rate to 29% from 32%, according to this latest statement from the central bank. We have seen the Argentinian economy expanding a little bit more than expected in the most recent period, continuing to show that sort of ongoing recovery for the economy after surpassing growth forecasts in that third quarter at least. So we are continuing to see those rate cuts from the central bank there to 29%. Let's take a look at Micron as we continue to process the news from Nvidia's approval that we're hearing of Samsung's 8-layer HBM3E AI memory chip. Of course, this is seen as sort of a little bit of incremental progress given how long this has been for the battle to be able to get that approval from Nvidia for that less advanced version of AI memory there. We are hearing that approval has been gained to supply that version of the 5G high bandwidth memory chips to Nvidia. So Samsung, of course, is still continuing to work to reverse that market position and the weakness that we've seen in the next generation of HBM chips, HBM4. It's hoping to become the main vendor for Nvidia's for those HBM4 chips as well. So this coming ahead of those final numbers from Samsung due out pretty imminently. So we'll see if there's any commentary from executives from Samsung on this in particular. This new type of chip giving memory makers a lucrative way to get in on that flood of spending when it comes to new computers used to train and run AI models and services, of course. So that difficulty of producing it has made it quite an interesting story within that space. Well, SK Hynix and Samsung, two of the stocks that we're watching as South Korean markets set to reopen after what has been a turbulent week. DeepSeek, of course, has been front and center. The Chinese startup upending tech stocks. Garfield Reynolds, who leads our Markets Live coverage, joins us now for more. So, and of course, we're also waiting for China markets to reopen after the Chinese New Year holidays. But what are the expectations given that we've had some pretty seismic moves?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to pass it because if you look at the today lead, we've got US stocks rose. The Apple earnings have ultimately been taken as promising, and we saw Chinese tech shares that trade in the US, they jumped overnight quite noticeably. So all of that sounds positive, but Korea hasn't traded since last Friday. And there's a lot of things that went on since last Friday. Nvidia is still heading for its worst week in a very long time. Both the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ are lower now than they were 5 days ago. So amidst all of that, I think there's a chance that at the very least there'll be a knee-jerk open down to the downside for the Kospi as it plays catch up, catch down, if you like, to what's gone on in the totality over the course of that week when they're away. And then we're looking very much to Samsung on that news from Nvidia, and also Hynix. As you say, that's a really key player and very Nvidia connected. And whether or not they can bounce back if they do start off being offered because of that, that lag. They need to price in 4 days of very intense action in the space of about 20 minutes at the open. Then where do we go from there? There's a chance that they come bouncing back up. There's also the question of tariffs. Donald Trump came out overnight and said, yes, tariffs are coming for Mexico and Canada, and almost certainly for China as well, at least 10%. And he's still got the general tariffs on the table. So now maybe the jump in the Golden Dragon shares overnight signals that Trump just talking about 10% for China at some stage is seen as being a good thing.
If at least in comparison to 25%, I guess.
Or 60%, which is what he said on the trial. So if that's the case, then you would think South Korea would benefit. Don't forget, South Korea is very trade exposed, very China exposed. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts. It's going to be fascinating to see how South Korea goes. If it does rise, that is going to send a very powerful, risk-on message for the rest of the region. A lot of it's still closed, but it would, augur well for the region's equities into next week, provided we don't get anything, any additional nasty surprises over the weekend.
Japan, we already saw a lot of positive factors feeding into yen positivity. Tokyo inflation, the number we got in the last few minutes, fastest in about a year. So, I mean, all signs are pointing in the right direction for more BOJ moves.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the only thing the BOJ has to fear, perhaps, is its own fear. When it comes to, I mean, it's already very much outside its comfort zone. The benchmark rate is well above anything that it's been for a very long time, and having carried out 3 rate hikes during this cycle, that's more rate hikes than they carried out in the decades beforehand. So the prospect of a 4th and perhaps a 5th that would get the rate to 1%, it's clear they feel very concerned about the potential impacts from that. It's another one of those instances where it's almost a mirror image of what went on with the Fed at the end of last year, where the Federal Reserve had sort of committed itself to a certain pace of easing, and it stuck with that even as the economy was signaling, yeah, you shouldn't really go, and that's why they paused this time. Now, the BOJ had signaled a certain level of tightening was likely. The data came in to very much back that and signal, in fact, that it should consider quickening the pace. Instead, it effectively stuck with what its plans were, or even tacked to the dovish side. So we're going to face this continuing pressure between, it looks like, data that's telling the BOJ you can afford to go faster, and the BOJ's own internal speed limit that's telling them, no, we need to wait for months now that we've made a move.
Hatfield Reynolds, who leads our Markets Live Asia coverage with what's going on this Friday. And of course, we're rating Samsung numbers as well as continuing to take a look at this market reaction as we head into the reopen of trading in South Korea. More ahead here on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg. Some more data when it comes to the Japanese economy. Industrial production numbers just crossing the Bloomberg now, rising 0.3% month-on-month, better than expectations of 0.2% there. That industrial output number on a year-on-year basis, a contraction of 1.1%, but still that is less steep than the 2.2% that was expected. That rebound likely on the back in December of the production of semiconductor-related items to try and meet that ongoing strong demand globally for advanced chips. We're also seeing the likelihood of February output to rise as well. Retail sales there, though, seeing a bit of a fall on a month-on-month basis. And all of this as a bullish case is building for Japan's cyclical stocks. The signs of a firm economic recovery are really coinciding with President Trump's plans to pump up the US economy. Let's dig into this. Our senior Asia stock reporter, Haidi Kasano. So, Haidi, we know about the strong correlation when it comes to Japanese stocks and Wall Street. So what's sort of the thesis here?
Good morning, Heidi. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the stock index in Japan, they have been range bound, so it's as if almost nothing is happening. But we are starting to see a sign of new rotation. And this time, some investors are focusing on cyclical stocks. Now, if you look back, before the US election and after the election victory of President Trump, basically what people have been talking about is the threat of tariffs. Now, after his inauguration, he seems to be going ahead with tariffs against Canada and Mexico, but he hasn't done universal tariffs or tariffs on China. And that is the main concern for Japanese stock investors. So, and once you consider the fact that the Trump's economic policy is also quite expansionary, you would think that there will be benefit for Japanese companies exposed to the US. And so that is why some investors are starting to think that maybe there's more upside for cyclical stocks like Japanese car makers or steel makers.
So what about BOJ tightening? Is that likely to sort of dampen the mood, or is that even being seen as, a sign of confidence in the future growth rate for Japan?
Hi, I'm glad you asked that because this is a very interesting topic. The textbook theory is that interest rate hike is negative for the economy and also the stock market. But when you look at what's happening in Japan, 30 years ago, Japanese companies are paying interest of like 30 trillion yen. Today, it's almost nothing. I mean, in the last few years, they were even a net receiver of interest. So once you take that into consideration, a rate hike wouldn't probably hurt their business that much. And so people starting to think that that is also a sign that basically the economy is doing very okay at the moment.
Bloomberg senior Asia stock reporter Haidi Okasano there. We do have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Taking a look at some of the stocks we're watching when trade reopens in Korea and also in the Japan session shortly. SK Hynix and Samsung will be front and center in terms of that attention. Korean markets reopen after the holidays, all coming, of course, after DeepSeek took markets for quite a ride this week. Korean tech stocks have yet to be able to price in these developments, so we'll be watching for that delayed reaction, if you will. And we're also awaiting numbers out of Samsung. Market opens in Seoul and Tokyo are next. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Asia trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens, and we'll be watching those chip stocks very closely. Of course, Heidi, this as we continue to watch the race on artificial intelligence and who has tech supremacy. Korea is coming back online, so we're going to watch the implications for SK Hynix on all of that progress made by Chinese startup DeepSeek. But now we have this news on Samsung and certification from Nvidia.
Yeah, a lot of that pent-up reaction we're waiting for, right? And it is a big tech-heavy sort of news day. We'll be watching Apple suppliers in this part of the world as well, given we had, the sort of downside when it comes to China and iPhones. Broadly, pretty good numbers, though, out of the likes of Apple and Intel.
Yeah, take a look at how Japan is coming online, because we've been watching those semiconductor names, anything related to chips this past week. And we are also reacting to some macroeconomic news. Of course, we had Tokyo inflation numbers rising at the fastest pace in a year, really adding to that narrative that the BOJ needs to continue hiking rates. The December unemployment rate also coming in lower than expected. The Nikkei now gaining ground for a third consecutive session. And we're seeing more strength for the Japanese yen. And this, as we also heard from the BOJ deputy governor, reaffirming those views that we already heard from the central bank, that they will keep raising rates this year. But really, the sector that we're watching is tech. And take a look at how South Korea is coming back from Lunar New Year holidays, because we're watching to see if SK Hynix would have to play catch down after all of that volatility around DeepSeek. We're also watching Samsung right now, because they've just obtained approval to supply a version of their 5th generation high bandwidth memory chips to Nvidia. And the Korean won at the moment weakening a little bit against the U.S. dollar, while Samsung Electronics is pointing downwards about 2%. Of course, we're also expecting their earnings and a breakdown of their results, Heidi, as we're also getting some news breaking on the terminal right now, Heidi.
Yeah, and we know that with all of the sort of excitement and speculation over the progress made by DeepSeek, there's a lot of concern when it comes to national security and how sort of this startup managed to make such progress despite ongoing US chip curbs. We are now hearing that the US is probing whether DeepSeek obtained those Nvidia chips through Singapore. Nvidia says it insists that all customers comply with all laws that are in place, but the White House and the FBI are currently studying if DeepSeek used Singapore middlemen to be able to obtain those chips. So this, of course, as we continue to see really the upending of expectations in terms of some of the progress that's been made, Shery, by DeepSeek, and how that's really calling into question the extraordinary valuations that we've seen for chip names, for other AI-related names. At the moment, we're seeing that the White House and the FBI are looking into if they use Singapore middlemen to be able to get the Nvidia chips.
Yeah, let's bring in our senior executive editor in technology, Tom Giles, who joins us right now. Tom, so we have seen this ongoing race in the chip sector, and of course, right now, accusations about how China really got its hand on these advanced chips. What do we know at this point?
That's right. That's right. Thank you for asking. I just had the opportunity to edit that story, this scoop out of our team around the world. This is showing that U.S. Officials are very skeptical about how DeepSeek got its technology. This is a technology that DeepSeek says is cheaper. It was less expensive to develop, and now rivals like Microsoft and OpenAI, as well as U.S. officials, including the FBI and the White House, the Treasury Department, are looking into where did they get this technology? Did they build it on the back of U.S. technology, more advanced technology? And did they obtain chips from Nvidia through Singapore, through third parties in Singapore? Did they obtain chips that are not supposed to end up in Chinese hands? Those are the questions that right now U.S. investigators are looking into.
Seeing some big moves when it comes to this space at the moment. Obviously, South Korea just coming back online after those holidays, Tom. We're seeing SK Haini shares sliding over 10% as the Korean market gets its first chance to react to all of this, in addition to, of course, what we're seeing at the moment, which is the launch of this investigation into whether DeepSeek circumvented those US restrictions. So at the moment, the debate, Tom, seems to be, was this really a case where scarcity boosts innovation and brilliance, or whether this, was a case of something else going on? But is there a real question as to whether ongoing US curbs on this technology have run into limitations?
Right, exactly. I mean, the U.S., as we've been reporting, has for several years now been placing restriction after restriction on U.S. technology chips. They went after one level of Nvidia chips, and then they went after another level, and they continue to ratchet up the restrictions because they want to make sure that companies in China are not obtaining this technology to advance their chip-making capabilities. They talk about it from a national security perspective. You could argue that there's also a competitiveness question here, and wanting to ensure that U.S. retains its edge in certain key areas like chip-making, as well as some areas of artificial intelligence. When DeepSeek hit earlier this week, as you'll recall, it sent shockwaves around the world, and it raised questions about just how far the U.S. is in generative artificial intelligence, the development of these chatbots that are making our work so much more efficient, that are making it easier to do coding. If a Chinese-based company can come out and say, we can do it at a fraction of the cost, we can sell it more cheaply, our tools are more efficient, and those are all the claims that are being made about DeepSeek, that has definitely raised questions about, one, the amount that we're investing in global infrastructure, in chips, all these billions of dollars that SoftBank and Meta and company after OpenAI, Microsoft, company after company are spending. Should they be spending that much money? So that's one set of questions. The other set of questions, as you alluded to, are these curbs that the U.S. is putting in place, are these limitations on NVIDIA chips, for example, are there ways that the Chinese are circumventing those, and can they use third parties in Singapore, for example, where we have seen a lot of, and we've been writing about a lot of Chinese companies, startups have been moving into Singapore. What the U.S. wants to know is, are they getting their hands on this stuff illegally?
And Tom, of course, as we're speaking, we're also getting the latest on Samsung earnings. That breakdown of fourth quarter sales coming in at 75.79 trillion won, the net 7.58 trillion won, beating expectations of that 7 trillion won when it comes to their earnings results. We're getting a little bit of a breakdown as well when it comes to the chip operating profit. Also, a little bit of a miss, 2.9 trillion won. The estimate was for over 4 trillion won. When it comes to the operating profit overall is around 6.5 trillion won. But Tom, really these advanced chips, HBM chips, and the different versions of them making and breaking fortunes at this point. We just heard from Samsung that sources telling us that they have obtained the certification from Nvidia on one version of their fifth generation chips.
That's right.
How significant of an advance is this, and how much could it help their earnings performance?
That's right. Samsung really needed a win in this particular area for many, many months. They have been trying to get certified. They've been trying to get a green light from Nvidia to be used alongside Nvidia. There have been questions about heat. There have been questions about whether they're up to snuff. What they got, what we reported earlier, is that they got approval from Nvidia on a certain level, not the most advanced, but still, it's important for a company that many had been concerned was falling behind, SK Hynix in particular. You saw in the numbers that Samsung just reported that the chip revenue did not come in as expected. Overall, looks like they did beat. So it's things like this that indicate they need some wins in the chip area. It's an area where Samsung has been suffering, and you're seeing movement in other stock, for example, Micron, which is a competitor in the area of memory, falling. So this does indicate that Samsung is moving in the right direction. The next thing we need to see is whether Nvidia is going to give them the green light on the most advanced chips, the ones that are most lucrative for Samsung.
You know, speaking of falling behind, Tom, just passing through Apple's numbers, China remains a bugbear. Obviously, Apple Intelligence remains a big question mark. Not a lot of enthusiasm for new iPhones. How much of this comes down to the fact that they need to somehow claw back that, market leadership when it comes to AI?
You know, one quarter after another, we keep getting indications that Apple is running into headwinds in China. This time around, you know that the most advanced artificial intelligence capabilities not available in China. It's an area of weakness for them. You've also got competitive pressure from the likes of Huawei, which keeps getting better and better. We just reviewed some of their new handsets, showing that they're really holding their own. So as one competitor after another gains ground in China, and you see restrictions on whether Apple can put its most advanced AI into its handsets, and the answer being no right now, that is a significant impediment there. Big drop off in China continues to be a real headache for them.
A senior executive editor in technology, Tom Giles there. Let's get some more analysis when it comes to the market implications. Jay Hatfield, CEO and CIO at Infrastructure Capital Investors. Jay, great to have you with us. And we're sort of coming to the end of what has been a frenetic week when it comes to AI, when it comes to the chip makers, and broadly all of this on the reaction to DeepSeek, right? What does this tell you about the valuations that we continue to seek and the concentration in these markets that, even as we see some signs of broadening out, is still so heavily invested in the Mag 7 stocks?
Thanks, Heidi and Shery. It's great to be on. Well, I'd say that we're less concerned about that concentration than most investors. If you really look at these mega cap companies, with the exception of Tesla, they really traded quite reasonable multiples relative to their growth. So Nvidia is only 30 times. Is growing closer to 20% a year. So we think actually these companies will become overvalued, and that's one reason we have a 7,000 target on the S&P this year, is that the enthusiasm part of the trade hasn't really started yet. It's hard to believe, but most of it's just coming from fundamental economics, extraordinary demand in the case of Nvidia, but also cloud demand. So we're not concerned about that concentration, and actually even Apple earnings were well received, and we still have Amazon and Google, which are likely to be good. So we continue to be bullish about the U.S. tech sector.
You continue to be bullish on Apple even with the sort of ongoing weakness story when it comes to its AI and China?
We're not really that bullish about Apple. We're neutral. It trades at a really high multiple, and it's a gigantic company that's growing pretty slowly. But the fact that the stock held in is bullish for the stock market as a whole. We prefer on the mega cap companies, Amazon, Broadcom, Amazon on cost cutting, Broadcom on the XPU opportunity. But nevertheless, all these companies are important to the overall U.S. market. So to the extent everybody was super negative about Apple's earnings, is probably one reason why it's up. As you pointed out, it wasn't really that fabulous. But it supports the market if it at least hangs in at this current valuation.
Jay, and of course, when it comes to tech, we continue to see the rivalry between Beijing and Washington. And now we're hearing that U.S. officials are probing whether DeepSeek bought those Nvidia chips through third parties in Singapore. Interesting that some of our colleagues were just starting to make the joke that we are going to now see tariffs on Singapore at some point. Just to make a point that we're seeing these tariffs coming in fast and furious, right? Mexico, Canada, maybe China. People say this is going to be inflationary, but you don't think so. Why?
Well, I think you're making a great distinction, Shery, in that the original tariffs are all politically motivated. So President Trump's trying to seal up the U.S. borders. That's why he picked on Canada and Mexico, and then also Colombia, because they wouldn't take a transport plane. So I think that's strangely actually a good indication. Scott Bessent is talking about in terms of economic sanctions. So to your point, maybe there'll be a political sanction against there's been any cheating on the export controls. But in terms of a broad-based economic tax, particularly on China, that could really disrupt global supply chains, that hasn't happened yet. But we also think everybody's ignoring the dollar is extremely strong, up 8% since Trump started to when it became obvious that Trump was going to be president. That's highly deflationary. So we think there's a lot of talking points out there, not looking at the economics. Also, you get revenue from tariffs, and they can be used to cut corporate taxes. So we think there's a lot of one-sided analysis, and that people will calm down when we get actual policy. And we think U.S. inflation is decelerating. PCE tomorrow, we're forecasting in line, but it's only 0.2, which is a very modest increase.
You also just recently launched that high-yield bond ETF. How are you playing rates at this point, then, given, of course, the implications coming from geopolitics?
Yeah, so BNDES is a high-yield fund. So that does mean it's less sensitive to interest rates, but that doesn't mean it's not a major tailwind. So we do think that investors should have a good bond allocation. Our target on the U.S. 10-year is 375. So that's 75 basis points lower than we are now. And everybody seemed to ignore it, but U.S. GDP slowed dramatically to the low 2% area from 3. We think it's going to go below 2. These rates are extremely restrictive in the U.S. Our money supply is shrinking. That's one way to analyze whether it's restrictive. We have a 3% year-over-year decline. There's only 17 basis points differential between Fed funds and the 10-year. There's normally 1%. So we think that the 10-year is going to come down as the Fed starts to realize inflation is decelerating rapidly. U.S. growth is decelerating. So we're still projecting 3 cuts and that the 10-year goes below 4%. So that'd be bullish for bonds, but also stocks and a rotation into non-tech stocks in the U.S., which hasn't really happened yet.
Jay Hatfield, good to have you with us, CEO and CIO at Infrastructure Capital Advisors, as we continue to watch the market gyrations. Here in Asia, it's all about tech right now because we are seeing that catch down by SK Hynix, losing more than 10% at one point. And this, of course, The caveat is that they rose almost 30% just this month alone. So you have to put it into context. They have been really leading when it comes to the AI race and the supply of really advanced chips. Now, will Samsung be able to catch up to them? Well, we are now hearing from sources that they obtained approval to supply a version of their 5th generation HBM chips to Nvidia. We have seen them miss when it comes to their profit on that AI memory catch-up race. So we'll continue to watch how these two biggest stocks in the South Korean market really progress in terms of the semiconductor race. This is Bloomberg.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons. Number one is the people that have poured into our country so horribly and so much. Number two are the drugs, fentanyl, and everything else that have come into the country. And number three are the massive subsidies that we're giving to Canada and to Mexico in the form of deficits. And I'll be putting the tariff of 25% on Canada and separately 25% on Mexico. And we will really have to do that because we have very big deficits with those countries. Those tariffs may or may not rise with time.
President Trump there speaking from the Oval Office, reiterating his threat to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico from Saturday. Let's bring Bloomberg's political news director, Jody Schneider, who joins us later with the latest. And Jody, we know that he's obviously still thinking about tariffs and that position on China as well. We're now also hearing that there's an investigation going on with the FBI in terms of how DeepSeek managed to potentially get Nvidia chips through Singapore or middlemen. That's sort of ongoing. There's a lot happening when it comes to this new administration.
There certainly is. And tariffs, of course, were something that we expected, that certainly Donald Trump campaigned for. But we really heard on the campaign trail a great deal about imposing even stiffer penalties in terms of tariffs on China than he had done in his first term. But now we're seeing Mexico and Canada, our neighbors, be the target of these purported tariffs. So Donald Trump today said that February 1st will be the date for the tariffs, which is this coming weekend. He had alluded to that earlier, but now he said, yes, the tariffs are coming on February 1st, 25% tariffs on both countries. Both countries have vowed to retaliate if that's the case. But there's a lot of skepticism as to whether these will actually take effect, certainly at that level. We saw a very short trade war with Colombia a week ago, where Donald Trump threatened to impose tariffs on Colombian goods. But when Colombia then relented and said they would take some military transport planes full of migrants, he then relented and said, OK, no tariffs for now. So we'll see what happens. Part of this is, of course, over migration, immigration at the Mexican border, somewhat at the Canadian border, but mostly at the Mexican border, something Donald Trump made one of his priorities, both on the campaign trail and since taking office, to really stem that illegal migration, as he says, illegal migration, and has taken a number of measures, including executive orders against it. But he's also saying fentanyl, the drugs, he says, are flowing into the country from Canada and Mexico both, and he wants to stop them. So we'll see how this goes this weekend, but it could be another negotiating tactic. And of course, Donald Trump loves nothing better than to negotiate.
What's been interesting has been his rhetoric, really, when it comes to around Canada, Mexico, and even Colombia, as you said, those tariffs, and that rhetoric has been pretty harsh. It felt like the rhetoric against Beijing has been more reined in, especially given that during the campaign, he promised to put tariffs on China day one. How are we expecting this relationship to move forward in 2025? And what's being done right now behind the scenes when it comes to those conversations between Beijing and Washington?
Yeah, that's right. This had been the one we all thought would take effect right away. but it's been more muted. And Donald Trump has said things like he respects Xi Jinping and he wants to perhaps even meet with him. He's had a phone call with him since becoming president. So it does appear there that he wants a more measured kind of response. Now we'll see whether this, maybe it is he's waiting to see what China is willing to do. And again, a negotiation before he threatens a specific tariff number, as though he's done with Canada and Mexico. But he has been somewhat more muted. He did say, however, when his new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, said that he wanted to impose kind of graduated tariffs, including against China, Donald Trump said, no, we have to go bigger than that. So again, there's these threats and there's this discussion at the same time. And he really hasn't imposed significant tariffs yet. It's only day 12 of his administration. But again, he had said day 1. So we're still waiting.
Bloomberg's political news director Jody Schneider there with the latest on that relationship and potential tariffs coming forward this year on these countries like China next. More ahead. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at some of the big movers in the Korea session right now. Of course, we're following those chip makers, given that Samsung Electronics has already released earnings as well, with profit missing in their chips sector. And this coming at a time when we're hearing that they obtained approval to supply a version of their 5th generation HBM chips. And SK Hynix having risen already about 27% this month alone. Before these losses of more than 8% at the moment, we're seeing that catch down after South Korea came back from holidays. Overall, we're seeing in the sector really when it comes to those gyrations around also cheaper Chinese AI potentially coming into play. Take a look at how some of those Japanese stocks are trading at the moment. And the one that we're watching is NEC. They're an information technology services company. We have seen them boosting their adjusted operating profit forecast for the full year. The stock gaining more than 13%, the most since 2008. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
We do have just some breaking news crossing the Bloomberg when it comes to Australian eco data. We do have the credit numbers as well as producer prices. Producer prices for the fourth quarter rising 3.7% year on year, or 0.8% quarter on quarter. Credit to business and consumers seeing a rise in December of over 0.5% month on month and 6.5% year on year. So we are starting to see sort of just a mixed messaging when it comes to the eco data out of Australia, but certainly very much opening the door to RBA rate cuts, particularly in light of cooling inflation levels. The likes of National Australia Bank now pulling forward its rate cut call to February. A lot of pricing had been sort of towards the middle of the year as we headed into the start of this year. But with inflation easing a lot more than expected in the last quarter, we are getting more expectations of imminent easing here.
And take a look on how Korean tech stocks are trading at the moment. They are coming back from a Lunar New Year holiday. So we were expecting that catch down to happen given all of the volatility that we've seen around Chinese tech startup DeepSeek and its AI capabilities. So we were expecting the downside on SK Hynix that has already rallied more than 20% this month alone. Right now, we're seeing losses of more than 8%, especially given that we have seen Samsung Electronics come out with their earnings. Although their chip division missed expectations, we have heard from sources that they've obtained approval to supply one version of their 5th generation HBM chips to Nvidia. So we might see more heated competition when it comes to advanced AI chips and what role these two companies will play. Of course, SK Hynix has been a leader at this front. It became the first supplier to mass produce those 8-layer HBM3E starting back in early 2024, and then they began supplying the more advanced 12-layer variety around the end of last year. So we have seen SK Hynix take that lead when it comes to that growth in the market, that growth also within the Kospi, because it's really powered the Kospi higher, Heidi, accounting for almost a third of the Kospi's about 6% rise last year.
Yeah, to some extent, that slide as it resumes trading today was largely expected, right? We're sort of bracing for it, given that most other markets other than Korea and, of course, also China, yet to reopen after the Chinese New Year holidays, have yet to have a chance to really price that in. But it's interesting, we're also seeing some of the heated sort of geopolitical developments as well, Shery. We have this story out over the past hour that the US is now probing, including the FBI and White House, if DeepSeek obtained those Nvidia chips from firms in Singapore, so using sort of a circumventing with those middlemen. So we continue to watch that. But it's quite interesting that if you take a look at what investors are seeing, there's a large proportion of investors that are not planning to change their exposure to the S&P 500, 60% roughly, believing that we'll see equity volatility this year, but that DeepSeek will kind of not really make much of a dent ultimately when it comes to Mag 7 stocks. Let's get you the latest when it comes to the corporate front. Bloomberg has learned that OpenAI is in talks to raise as much as $40 billion in a funding round led by SoftBank. The ChatGPT maker is in discussions to raise funds at a pre-money valuation of $260 billion. It was valued at $157 billion back in October. Bloomberg earlier reported that SoftBank was considering investing $15 to $25 billion into OpenAI. It's a deal that would potentially make the Japanese company its biggest backer. Meanwhile, India is racing to build its own AI model. The country's technology minister says the government has selected 18 AI-related applications for support in sectors including agriculture and climate change. The goal is to create AI that can compete with global leaders, and 6 major developers are expected to build models by the end of this year. Cybersecurity firms say companies and government agencies around the world are restricting access to the Chinese AI startup DeepSeek. We're told the move is driven by concerns over potential data leaks to the Chinese government and weak privacy safeguards. Governments worldwide are scrutinising DeepSeek's privacy controls. Italy has blocked the service, while Ireland has requested information on user data. Well, Bloomberg Originals has been looking closer into the sudden impact of DeepSeek on established assumptions about the cost of developing AI technology. Take a look.
January 27th, 2025 may go down in history as DeepSeek Day.
DeepSeek shaking up global tech.
Nvidia losing nearly $600 billion in market cap today alone.
A handful of other US chip stocks, many trading at 30 times earnings or more, plummeted as well. They dragged down the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq 100.
The entire stock market has been really hinging on this AI supply chain. And what DeepSeek threw into question is whether or not that supply chain really needs to be built out as much as the companies have projected.
DeepSeek makes an app similar to ChatGPT or Claude. It'll write code, answer questions, or script an empathetic breakup text.
It quickly surged to the top of the App Store and it surpassed OpenAI's ChatGPT.
And what's extraordinary is its apparent quality and low cost, and of course its seeming appearance out of nowhere.
DeepSeek revealed it was able to build this model and train it at just a fraction of the cost.
In fact, it ranks among the top performers on a UC Berkeley affiliated leaderboard called Chatbot Arena. But it's also open source. Developers can inspect the code, modify it, and run it on their own servers, even for commercial use.
The release of DeepSeek AI from a Chinese company should be a wake-up call.
Washington, for a number of years now, has been restricting China's access to cutting-edge chips, which they thought would hold it back significantly in the AI sector.
DeepSeek's focus on efficiency rather than funding meant it could engineer itself into a competitive position, even if it was standing on the shoulders of giants.
There are a lot of people now in Silicon Valley trying to decipher how exactly DeepSeek was able to build this model, whether it used technology from other companies, and whether it used more chips than it's let on.
I don't think there's a clear answer to that yet, but I do think they have shown, in the research that DeepSeek has published, that they have been able to, come up with their own innovations here, and they have been able to to really be efficient with the technology that they do have.
This is a bit of a wake-up call for the AI industry.
And subscribers can watch that report in full on the terminal and Bloomberg.com. And it'll also be available later on the Bloomberg Originals YouTube channel as well. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at how Korea tech stocks are coming online after Lunar New Year holidays. Of course, we're following news about Samsung obtaining certification for a version of their 5th generation HBM chips that they will now start supplying to Nvidia. Not to mention that we got their earnings, chips missing to the downside, and of course that catch down given that they're coming back from holidays. Let's bring in SK Kim, Executive Director and Analyst at Daiwa Securities. SK, good to have you with us. I just want to start with this news that Bloomberg just broke in the past hour about Samsung obtaining that certification from Nvidia. We're talking about just one version of their 5th generation HBM chips, a less advanced HBM3E variety, according to sources. How significant would this be for Samsung, especially in its race against SK Hynix as well?
Yeah, actually, when Samsung announced it, the third quarter earning 3 months ago, the company guided that there has been delay in supplying of the HBM3E product. So that is about this, the Gen 6, it's the 8 high HBM3E product to Nvidia. So yeah, I think this is some positive because of the many investors are worried about Samsung is unable to supply the mainstream product. So they're still lagging behind the SK Hynix around 9 months, in 9 months. But anyway, they can now supply the mainstream product for HBM3E.
How much will it help their chips profit? I mean, we got the earnings reaction and the results and the breakdown. Give us your take about the latest results.
Yeah, I think they missed the consensus, mainly from the semiconductor division. Firstly, the foundry business, I assume they widened the losses with the weak demand from China mobile, and also the limited, their customer bases for leading edge node. But I also assume that even memory, their ASP increased meaningfully from the HBM3E supply. But with the weaker commodity demand, so that will negatively impact on the shipment growth in first quarter. So that will also the earning decline quarter on quarter for memory division.
So do you see this more as an incremental development or something that could be a game changer in terms of the overall effort to play catch up?
But actually the thing is that now this year, the mainstream product for HBM3E to shifting to the 12 high product. So SK Hynix started some volume production from end of last year, early this year. So, but Samsung is redesign of their 12 high HBM3E. So yeah, we need to monitor their progress of the redesign of chip and the successful supply to Nvidia, following the Gen 5 8 type product. Maybe sometime in mid of this year.
When it comes to other parts of the business, we're seeing weaker demand for conventional chips, mobile devices, smartphones, and some of the other devices and gadgets are facing increased competition and less demand as well. Do you worry about the sort of broad weakness that we see in some of these other business units?
Yes, even in the semiconductor, Samsung has higher exposure to China, and also they are supplying, the AI chips to Chinese customer. So, and the commodity, there's a competition where Samsung will have more impact compared with SK Hynix. But the recently some the DeepSeek, for example, such a low cost AI could it be positive for its set device division, especially the smartphone? The Samsung just announced it, S25, the flagship model. But hopefully they can be positive for this smartphone set device division.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the implications of Chinese startup DeepSeek making these inroads when it comes to producing more cheaper, more efficiently. Does this mean that we're going to see less chips needed in the future if other manufacturers also go in that direction as well, when you can actually train AI without all of these chips necessary? And also, what are the implications for the tech rivalry that we're seeing between Beijing and Washington when it comes to those export controls? Will we see more adjustments coming from Washington as well?
Yes. Yeah, I think the DeepSeek is kind of low-cost, high-efficiency AI model. So, yeah, there will be some positive for overall the AI ecosystem and industry. But you know that the reason the current mainstream, the AI model is using a lot of the high-end, high-performance GPU and HBM, and so I assume it could be some negative for the the high-end the AI semiconductor supplier, and also so U.S. government, if you assume that they're expanding the sanctions on the export control, that could be negative for the company like Samsung Electronics, because the Samsung has higher exposure to China. Even within Nvidia, they are main supplier of the H20 AI GPU solution.
SK, always great to chat with you. SK Kim of Daiwa Securities there. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
CBS News is reporting that a black box has been recovered from the American Airlines jet that crashed in Washington after a mid-air collision with the U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter. 67 people were killed in one of the deadliest U.S. air disasters in decades. Let's bring in our aviation reporter, Danny Lee, who's been following the latest developments. Danny, already this whole tragedy been politicized. President Trump attacking DEI programs at the FAA following this collision. What do we know at this point about what could have caused this incident?
There's been a lot of focus around staffing at the air traffic control tower and also just how busy Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport is on a daily basis. And so throughout the day on Thursday, we had a lot of comments, a political reaction. President Donald Trump had actually, in fact, used his appearances through the day to attack DEI, these diversity and inclusion programs. With no evidence, he stressed that these were potentially at fault for this catastrophic disaster. But when you look at the facts, there's still an investigation ongoing, and that's going to be down the conclusion of what has happened. It's going to be down to the National Transportation Safety Board to try and establish what happened and potentially to offer improvements. But clearly something badly went wrong, and officials earlier on Thursday said that up until the moment of the collision, that the aircraft, when they met, were on the appropriate track, but clearly something went wrong in the dead of night.
And of course, we're seeing the beginnings of how this administration is sort of handling the aftermath of this. But do we know in terms of the time frame on when we could start to get some answers on further briefings now that the black box has been recovered?
We should expect in the near term more briefings, but the National Transportation Safety Board said that as far as answers are concerned, they need time to appropriately gather all the evidence that they require. Clearly, one of the important things is the black boxes that they need from both aircraft. We are obviously starting to get some news that at least one or more of the black boxes has been recovered, but we'll get an answer, at least preliminary answer in 30 days or so, but then more conclusive answers will take a lot longer because these things do inevitably take time. But clearly there has been a clamour for answers and a lot of frustration given this is the worst aviation disaster in America, in civil aviation disaster in America in a couple of decades now.
Daniel Lee, our Bloomberg transport reporter there. And other stories that we're following at this hour, the European Union has resuspended its case against China at the World Trade Organization over allegations of economic coercion targeting Lithuania. The case was first filed in 2022 after Beijing imposed trade restrictions on Lithuania due to its official contact with Taiwan. The EU had suspended the case in 2024 but resumed it last week to prevent the case from lapsing. President Trump has insisted that Egypt and Jordan will take in Palestinians from Gaza despite both countries rejecting the idea. Meanwhile, Israel has released another 110 Palestinian prisoners under the ceasefire deal after a brief delay over the safety of Israeli hostages. The next hostage prisoner swap is expected to go ahead on Saturday as planned.
Shery, India's government is set to present its budget on Saturday. This is the first of Prime Minister Modi's third term. The spending plan is expected to focus on efforts to boost consumption as the government tries to stave off an economic slowdown. Let's bring in Smarty Panda here in Sydney for more, because we're looking at sort of potentially income tax changes, some of the other efforts to boost consumption, I guess. You know, how much is at stake here given the uncertain geopolitical environment that we're dealing with, and also questions over the government's ability to be able to turn around the economic ship?
Yes, this is a critical juncture for India. This is Modi's third term, and he really needs to make that pitch, and this budget really needs to show what India is offering to the world as well. In terms of consumption, India is stuck in this middling growth of 6% and thereabouts, and Modi had last year said that India would be a $5 trillion economy by 2025, and it's 2025, and we are $1 trillion short there. So whether this budget is really making that attempt to boost consumption enough, boost infrastructure spending enough to speed up the economy, which is slowing at the moment, that's a big question mark, especially because they are also focused on fiscal consolidation, which is a big theme as well.
What are we expecting in terms of winners and losers in this one?
The biggest winner might be the average Indian middle class. There's an expectation of a personal tax cut there. There is some expectation that the filing of taxing is going to become simplified and easier as well, and that is going to improve compliance. Infrastructure spending is running at record levels, but it's not expected to be increased further because the government wants to cut down debt. It wants to improve its debt to GDP ratio and is aiming for a sovereign rating upgrade as well from one of the ratings agencies. And the fiscal outlook is looking better. The debt outlook is looking better. But for a growing economy like India, do you want to cut debt and slow the economy down or not? Like, that's a big question.
Especially when you have potential tariff threats from the Trump administration.
That's exactly right. And that also puts the onus then on the Reserve Bank of India to spark growth, to revive growth in the economy. And that is perhaps why there is the expectation that the RBI will start its easing cycle next week as well.
A Bloomberg economy reporter, Swati Pandey, there with a look ahead at this weekend's India budget. We are also watching the commodities space very carefully, given we've seen some really big moves, particularly when it comes to gold as well as oil and some of these tariff threats, as well as the pouring of haven demand into the likes of gold and oil. Gold, for example, hitting that record high as the Trump tariff threats really pouring into that haven demand there. We're also seeing a lot of these miners, iron ore as well as gold-related miners, accelerating in the Australian session. New York traded crude. We're seeing a little bit of upside, but not quite the spike that we had. We saw a stronger advance of close to around 1.5% on the announcement of those tariff threats against Canada and Mexico, as well as China. Shery.
All of that, of course, adding to the uncertainty around the South Korea market as well. A very export-dependent economy there, and we're seeing that tech catch down at play right now, with the Kospi losing 0.9%, being led lower by tech, industrials, and materials. SK Hynix, one of the big losers in today's session, as Samsung also reported earnings with their chip operations missing to the downside, but now we have news that they got approval to supply a version of their 5th-generation HBM chips to Nvidia. That's it from the Asia trade. The China show is next. This is Bloomberg.